We're going to have a bit of a job to do. It's going to be a little difficult for us because even already, and more so as we go along, that breakfast is going to start coming up through the floor. And I need you to hang with me for just a minute, okay? Just hang in there just a little bit, but and we'll be heading down there shortly. I typically like to start off with something humorous, and I found a story. I got some help, actually. Somebody sent me an email with a bunch of jokes in it, and they must apparently it's becoming evident that I'm running out of any good ones. So I got some help this week. This is about this elderly lady, and she was really distraught. She phoned her doctor's office, and she was just all in a panic. And she wanted to talk to her doctor right away, and she says, "Doctor, I'm very concerned about this medication that you prescribed for me. You said that I'm going to be taking this for the rest of my life." And the doctor said, "Well, yes, I'm afraid that that's correct, but you can handle it. It'll be okay. And I thought we went over all that during your visit." And she says, "Well, yes, but I went down to the pharmacy today and picked it up. And when I got it, I called because I was just wondering how serious is my condition, because the prescription says there's no refills." Oh, see, it's a groaner. Okay, well. Well, all right. So we've been discussing these two topics over this last series, and today's the last one in the series, but the title of this series has been Covenant and Kingdom. And if you've been following along, I hope that these two themes that we say have been running through, they run all throughout the Bible, kind of the DNA of the Bible, if you will, that in your own reading, in your own time in the Word of God, as you're in the Bible and reading scriptures, that you might be recognizing these themes as you go along. And you're reading something, it says, "Oh, that's kind of talking about kingdom." Or you see another one, "Oh, that one's talking about covenant. I see this is about identity." And you're going along and say, "Oh, this is about God's kingdom and his work here in this world." And these themes are intended to really bring new life to the Bible as you're reading through it. And you see how God speaks to us, and it helps us to really see what he's saying as we understand it in the context of those two themes. Now, today's the last message in this series, and it might seem a little backwards from a lot of traditional Easter services, and I say that because it was actually last week that we talked about the cross. And everybody's probably thought, I've lost my mind, and I got my sermons out of order because isn't this week supposed to be about the cross and the resurrection, what that means? But we talked about the message of the cross last week, and when maybe normally it would be the Easter message, and I understand that, and I believe in the power of the cross. All right, we're here because of the power of the cross. We talk about the cross. We know the meaning of the cross, that there's power in the cross, that there's hope in the cross and what Jesus has given to us because of his willingness to demonstrate his love and sacrifice on that cross. But it's interesting as we look at the resurrection story through the lenses of covenant and kingdom, something else emerges, and we see that resurrection is really not so much a message about the cross as it is the message of the launching of the church. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Whereas it's true that the victories in the cross, our forgiveness comes from the cross, even the love of God is seen in the cross. What we're celebrating today is an empty tomb, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and it marks the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. That's really the kind of the moment when his time of ministry and walking amongst the people was ending. And he wants what he's transitioning there is the beginning of our ministry. It's the beginning of our time. It's the beginning of our kingdom responsibility. Remember, we said that covenant is about relationship. Covenant is all this language that says that we belong to the family of God. But kingdom is about responsibility as we're serving the Lord in that kingdom. And so Jesus launches the church to make an impact in the world and to live out the hope that we have in him. What we saw him do, we are to take up the same ministry and the same mission. And I know that I've quoted this before, but especially with this morning's topic, it bears repeating that the local church is the hope of the world. Now, we say amen, it sounds right, part of it, but in another sense, don't we also have a little bit of a pushback? I mean, because doesn't it sound like, I like that way that's, I like that's good, I think that's good, but isn't Jesus the hope of the world? Isn't it Jesus that brings that to, I mean, right? We put our hope on him. But Jesus asks us, and I like this phrase, he asks us to represent him in the world. So we're not only, we represent him in what we do and who we are and how we live, but because he lives within us, we're representing him to a world that can't see him but needs to know him. See, we are to be the hands and the feet and the voice of Jesus in our everyday lives, in everything that we do and how we live and work and connect with neighbors and family and friends and co-workers and all of that. We are representing and representing Jesus. Ephesians 4, 1 through 13, or excuse me, 1 through 3 says, I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And I was thinking this morning as the team was, leading us through that song, Because He Lives. And I just thought, my last couple of weeks have just been downright awful. They've been tough. But I know who holds the future. I can put my trust not in my circumstances and the trials and the struggles, but in the Lord that loves me. And he can help me through the pain. He can help me through the stress. He can help me through the trials. I don't have to get my identity from who I think I am or what I'm trying to accomplish. It's in Jesus Christ. And I know that he's with me, and I know that he's with you. And if you've gone through a difficult couple of weeks, we come before the Lord this morning, and just being in the presence of each other and just gathering together as the church, and just by being with the Lord and worshiping and praying and hearing from Scripture, we are already enriched in just a few moments of a day. There is that verse we just talked about, and it's not the main text we're going to look at in just a moment, but that verse is just saying that we should be worthy, we want to live worthy of the calling that we have, because it's the hope of the world. It brings the power. When we walk in patience, when we walk in gentleness, when we walk in humility, and when we work towards unity to bring the Spirit of God into our midst and into everywhere that we go, we're the church together, and we're also the church that works in the world around us. Now I want to share a little video. It's called I Love My Church. And it's just some testimonies of some people talking about why they love their church. This isn't our story necessarily, and yet hopefully it is in our own unique way. So the team's going to help us with some lights, and we'll just check out what some of these folks are saying about how they found power in their church. Isn't that fabulous? I mean, don't we want that for each of our experiences, but also to be the experience of those that we connect with, that come and visit. I mean, every time we gather, may we just be a blessing to somebody. And I notice so often that as people come in, you'll see a group in a corner somewhere talking about something's going on in their life. Somebody else will be praying somewhere else. There'll be a classroom going on down the hall, and they're learning from the Bible. We gather together and we worship the Lord. And in all of these things that take place, it makes a difference. It makes an impact when we gather together. And we love our church, and we want to continuously work towards building a better church, a more effective church that impacts people's lives, because it's a calling that Jesus Christ has given to us. Now, how does it work? And from that, I want to take a little quick walk, if you will, from last week's discussion to where we need to talk about today. Because if you're a Christian And I know this is a Sunday morning where we get lots of guests and visitors that come. And we're so excited and delighted in every guest that we have. And I want to say this really carefully in the second one, because we're probably a little bit more visitors in the second service. But this message was really more intended for the church, and really more intended for those that are walking with Jesus. And I hope it brings a little bit of challenge into your life. Because if you're a Christian today and you're going to live a life worthy of representing Jesus Christ in your life, then you need to be thinking about your involvement in the church and what that looks like. Now, but it may not be what you first think of, and so let's find out. Last week, we did talk about the cross and the message of its covenant message that brings us into relationship with God. And we talked about Jesus being the substitution for the sins of the world. That for you and for me, his death on the cross represents forgiveness of sin, that we can be reconciled with God. And we went through all that. What's interesting as we consider that is from the resurrection, Jesus was brought back to life. He resurrected from the tomb. His lifeless dead body laid in a hole in the ground. The stone covered it over. And then 3 days later, that stone opened up and he burst forth with new life. That's the message of Easter. But he always maintained the scars in his body for what he had done. They always remained. They stayed there. Even new life came. Even though his body was completely healed and restored, the scars stayed. And forever into eternity, I think. I don't know, I have to look that up. I wonder if there's a verse that talks about that. It seems like there is, but what we recognize is that Jesus carries the mark on his body of covenant relationship. I will always love you. I will always accept you. I will always be there for you. You're my brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. And he carried the scars of covenant. Now, in the story, we know that Jesus did not leave the world, but for about 40 days, he continued to meet with various groups, and he did even a little bit more teaching before he ascends into heaven. And after Jesus leaves, the disciples are now beginning to move into that apostleship where they're leading and directing and expanding the church. And they're beginning to establish. And mostly what they're doing is going into the temple in Jerusalem, telling about Jesus is the Messiah. They're mostly speaking to the Jews and telling them the Messiah has come. Put your trust in him. He's resurrected. He's proven who he is. He is our king. And they are establishing his kingdom at that time. And then believers are starting to put their faith in Jesus Christ and become followers of Jesus. Many do that, and the word begins to spread rapidly, and people start becoming Christians. By the thousands, people are becoming Christians. Well, you may remember as we studied the book of Acts not too long ago, in fact, it was our last series, but way back at the beginning of the book of Acts, which is really a history of this beginning of the church, the Jews began gathering together, even living together and creating community together now as Christians. But the non-believing Jews wanted to stop the church movement, if you remember. And so they began to create problems. They began to try to stop them. They began to try to even persecute them. In their work, they eventually round up all the disciples and they bring them in, they arrest them, and they tell them not to talk about Jesus anymore. They can't be starting this church. They can't be doing what they're doing. But they are all false, and they had to be stopped. And you have to leave the Jews alone was basically the message. And so they arrested them, and they eventually beat them and flogged them for it, trying to get them to stop. And you remember how we saw that pattern over and over and over. Well, eventually that didn't really work, but instead the disciples were they were thankful They were glad. They went home rejoicing and thanking God that they were found worthy of suffering for the cause of Jesus Christ. But shortly after that, to kind of step it up even further, since the beating didn't work, they decided to kill one of them, and they ended up killing Stephen. And look at what happens next after the killing of Stephen. In Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Give you a moment to try to find that. And if you want to read with us, it's Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Have it on the screen. This week, I think it's correct. Last week, there was a mix-up. I said it was in Luke. It ended up being in John. But I was consistently wrong in all the references. So at least... you know what I said, what that said, but the bulletin said they all said it wrong. But okay, Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Stephen has just been killed. Now Saul, who later becomes Paul, is standing there. It says in verse 1, and Saul approved of their killing him. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. So think about what's going on there. It's so interesting that somebody came in this morning and we had this exact same conversation. What Satan intended for evil, God used for good. It's so interesting. Now, this is a terrible and a difficult story for the early Christians. As the persecution was increasing, going from house to house, and anybody that had the markings of any kind, of any way they could determine they were becoming Christian, dragging them from their home and threatening them, probably kicking them, beating them. It doesn't seem like they killed a lot of them, but at this point. But even still, drugged from their home just for being a Christian. I mean, didn't we just watch this last week over in Kenya? It's kind of what happened. They're looking for the Christians. And if they found one, they'd lay him on the ground and shoot him in the back of the head. And you guys want to send me there. Wait a minute. I'm sorry, maybe that was inappropriate. Michael came back from Kenya, and I saw him briefly this week, and we had a chance to talk for a few minutes while we took him to the airport. He's already got his son and going back. We're hoping to see him again when he gets back from that trip. Praise the Lord, the backbiting is about 700 kilometers from community where our orphanage is, and so there's distance there, but still, it was troubling to him and difficult for his home country, and he and I talked about being thoughtful of and praying for our brothers and sisters around the world that live in that reality. And it really made this verse come a little bit more alive. I mean, that's what was happening. These Christians were being persecuted for being followers of Jesus. But it was intended to stop the church. They're trying to quiet their tongues. They were trying to stop the message. They were trying to get people to give up on the mission that Jesus had given to them, to go out and tell the story and the good news of Jesus Christ. But what happens instead? Instead of stopping it, instead of confining it, instead of ending the church, it spread it all throughout the world. It just moved it on. They dispersed, and the result was the church spreading all throughout the whole wide world. And today, we see followers of Jesus everywhere, in just about every corner of the world. They could no longer gather in the temple, and so they became the church out in the world. And the church moved into homes, and they would go out into neighborhoods, and they would help each other, and they would gather together, and they would pray wherever they could get together, and they would gather any scripture that they had, and they would talk about it and try to understand what God was saying to them. And they couldn't do in the structure that they had before, and so instead they looked to each other to grow the church, to help each other, and to see it continue growing and expanding. And it did, from this city to the next city, from one nation to the next, growing over and over and over until today we see it spread throughout the whole world, telling everyone far and wide the love of God and the salvation of Jesus Christ. The church has moved on as it has taken on the mission of Jesus Christ. Now, I've been mentioning that some of the inspiration for this series comes from a book called Covenant Kingdom by Mike Breen. And he wrote this: from this point on, the early church principally gathered around the pre-existing social unit of the household. Or the Greek word is oikos. And it was interesting. I did just a real quick look into this. And oikos was quite often actually a large structure with extended family all living together, and there'd be different rooms and a general courtyard where they might come out and have a social space, and they'd have different areas for different things, lounging room, a fun room, a dining room, a kitchen, and all the things. And as the family would grow, they could add on extra living rooms, living spaces for different family members, and they lived together. We have I don't know, everybody says that different things are the best invention since sliced bread. And it always makes me wonder, well, what was before sliced bread? And we've also had bad inventions too. And I think one of the worst inventions is the garage door opener. I mean, it's extremely convenient. But what happens is now we come home, we hit the little button, the door opens, we go into our garage, it closes behind us, we never have to get out of our car, and we never see our neighbors anymore, where we just go into our home, we just go from one little private space to the next. And they lived totally different back then. And the church moved into this context where they lived together and they worked together and they were together. And the church, being a part of the church, is about doing life together. It's unfortunate we've largely abandoned this kind of living today. Church has become big business. Going to church is about being entertained, being fulfilled, being taken care of. Church is about finding someone that can listen to you and pray for you. Church is about, getting up to the pastor, make sure you talk to him because he knows all the things in your life. And we want to continue all those things. All those things are good things. We want to learn from the Bible. We want to go on mission trips. But the church doesn't have to be responsible for all that because we are the church. You see, unfortunately, if we want to do a mission trip, it's something you organize and you go to somewhere far away. If you want to have a Bible study and you want to learn from the Bible, well, you need kind of a special person, an educated one to take care of that. So you hire a professional that knows everything about it to tell it to you. If you want to have a good service, you got to get a pastor that can stand up here and he's good looking and he's really interesting to listen to and he has funny jokes and all that kind of stuff. And I know, and you guys haven't found one yet. So you have to keep on looking. But right, we've taken the church, we've said the church has to be all these kinds of things. But that's not the way the early church was. They lived their lives together. They learned from each other. They prayed for each other. House to house, living, they helped each other. They cared for each other. They looked to Jesus together. And they served the world, sharing the message any way they could, everywhere they went. So here's the question, are you in the church today? Now you could say yes, because I'm in the building. But are you in that kind of church? Because for those early leaders in the early church, it meant that you were doing life together as a follower of Jesus Christ. Are you in that church? Are you in that church? I remember a girl, her name was April. And I don't know where we came across, how we first met. She started coming to our youth group. And April, very attractive, very pretty girl, with a life in chaos. And she knew of Jesus. She'd grown up in a Catholic church, but her home life was difficult. There was abuse in her past. When we met her, she seemed really happy on the outside, but she was suicidal, beginning to kind of dabble in drugs, trying to find different boys that would help her feel better about herself. Usually made her feel worse in the end. And she was just so lost. She had so much potential, but she was just so lost. And I'm so glad she just found a youth group that could accept her and loved her, and she had a beautiful singing voice. She loved to worship the Lord. She had this, it's kind of a specific talent. I didn't even know this, but she played tambourine, but the way she played tambourine, man, that thing would fly through the air and spin around and all those kinds of stuff. It was really fun to watch her. And she was able to get beyond that. Her church, it was our youth group at that time, but her church helped her to see Jesus, and it brought healing to her heart and her life. And that's the work, the story, and the message of what we do. Are you a part of that church? Are you a part of that church where you're living your life with other Christians, other followers of Jesus Christ, doing life together in every sense of what that means for the purpose of being on mission for Jesus Christ?